Indigenous peoples and early civilizations. The first Canadians, long before European explorers set foot on Canadian soil, sophisticated civilizations thrived across what we now call Canada. These were not primitive societies, but complex networks of nations with rich cultures, advanced technologies, and deep spiritual connections to their lands. The First Nations peoples, as they came to be known, developed remarkable ways of life perfectly adapted to Canada's diverse environments. In the Pacific Northwest, magnificent coastal tribes like the Haida and Kwakwaka'wakw constructed impressive wooden longhouses and carved the iconic totem poles that still captivate us today. They developed sophisticated fishing techniques using cedar canoes that could reach up to 15 meters in length. Their potlatch ceremonies, elaborate gatherings where wealth was distributed among guests, demonstrated a unique approach to economics and social status that fascinated early anthropologists. Moving inland, the Plains peoples, including the Blackfoot, Cree, and Sioux, mastered the art of buffalo hunting from horseback. This way of life transformed dramatically when horses, reintroduced by Europeans, spread across the continent in the 1700s. The introduction of these animals revolutionized their hunting practices and warfare tactics, leading to what historians often call the Golden Age of Plains culture. Further north, the Inuit developed ingenious survival methods in the Arctic regions. Their sophisticated understanding of ice patterns and animal migrations allowed them to thrive where others would perish. The kajak, commonly known as kayak, became one of their most famous inventions. A sleek hunting vessel that could navigate icy waters with remarkable precision. Their igloos, temporary shelters built from snow blocks, demonstrated an unparalleled understanding of insulation and structural engineering. Perhaps most remarkably, these diverse groups developed complex trade networks that spanned thousands of kilometers. Copper from the Arctic made its way to southern regions, while shells from the Atlantic coast found their way deep into the continent's interior. These trade routes weren't merely commercial. They facilitated cultural exchange and diplomatic relations between distant nations. The Eastern Woodlands peoples, including the Huron-Wendat and Iroquois Confederacy, created some of North America's earliest democratic systems. The Iroquois Confederacy, formed possibly as early as the 1400s, influenced later political thinkers with its sophisticated system of governance and decision-making processes. Their Great Law of Peace established a framework for conflict resolution and community organization that endured for centuries. These civilizations lived in harmony with their environments, developing sustainable agricultural practices that European settlers would later struggle to comprehend. The Three Sisters method of planting corn, beans, and squash together created mutually beneficial crop systems that maintained soil fertility while providing balanced nutrition. As we look back at these early chapters of Canadian history, it becomes clear that the land was far from empty or undeveloped when Europeans arrived. Instead, it was home to thriving nations with complex social structures, rich artistic traditions, and deep philosophical understandings of their place in the world. These foundations would profoundly shape Canada's development in ways that continue to resonate through the country's identity today. The story of Canada doesn't begin with European contact. Rather, this moment represents a significant turning point in a much longer narrative. Understanding these early civilizations helps us appreciate the depth and complexity of Canada's true historical roots, setting the stage for the dramatic changes that would follow in subsequent centuries. European exploration and the fur trade era. The story of European exploration in Canada begins not with conquest, but with curiosity and commerce. It was the search for new trade routes to Asia that first drew European sailors to Canada's eastern shores in the late 1500s. The abundant natural resources they discovered, particularly fur-bearing animals, would spark a commercial revolution that shaped Canada's early development in profound ways. French explorers, led by figures like Jacques Cartier and later Samuel de Champlain, established the first permanent European settlements along the St. Lawrence River in the early 1600s. These outposts weren't military fortresses or agricultural colonies. They were trading centers designed to facilitate what would become Canada's first major industry, the fur trade. This economic focus created unique relationships between European settlers and Indigenous peoples that differed markedly from other colonial experiences in the Americas. The fur trade established intricate networks across vast distances, connecting the Atlantic coast with the interior of the continent. Canoes became the primary vessels of commerce, and Indigenous guides and traders became essential partners in this new economic system. The coureurs des bois, independent French traders who lived and worked alongside Indigenous communities, developed a distinct Canadian identity that blended European and Indigenous cultures in remarkable ways. This period saw the establishment of New France, stretching from Acadia in the east to the Great Lakes region. However, unlike Spanish colonies to the south, New France remained relatively sparsely populated. By the mid-1700s, despite over 150 years of French presence, the total population remained under 70,000 settlers. This small population maintained control over an enormous territory through alliances with Indigenous nations and sophisticated trade networks, rather than through military might or agricultural settlement. The Hudson's Bay Company, established by British interests in 1670, transformed the nature of the fur trade. Their string of forts along Hudson Bay created a different model of trade, one where Indigenous trappers brought fur to fixed locations rather than traders traveling inland. This development intensified competition between French and British interests, setting the stage for increasing imperial rivalry throughout the 18th century. The economic importance of the fur trade cannot be overstated. Beaver pelts, highly valued in Europe for making fashionable hats, became the currency of the Canadian frontier. This focus on fur created both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, it fostered cooperation between European traders and Indigenous peoples, leading to cultural exchange and mutual economic benefit. On the other hand, it created dependencies that would have long-lasting social and economic consequences. By the mid-1700s, the fur trade had pushed European influence far beyond the original coastal settlements. Trading posts appeared across the continent, from the Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountains. These remote outposts became crucial points of contact between European and indigenous worlds, places where goods, ideas, and sometimes diseases were exchanged. The patterns of trade established during this period laid the groundwork for future westward expansion and settlement. The competition between French and British interests eventually led to military conflict. The 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War, marked the culmination of decades of rivalry. Yet even during wartime, the fur trade continued almost uninterrupted, demonstrating its central importance to both colonial powers. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, transferring control of New France to Britain, the existing trade networks and relationships proved remarkably resilient. This era of exploration and trade left lasting legacies. Many place names, trading routes, and cultural practices established during this period continue to shape Canadian identity today. The economic patterns set during the fur trade era influenced settlement patterns and economic development for generations to come. Most importantly, the relationships, both cooperative and exploitative, established between European settlers and Indigenous peoples during this time would profoundly affect Canada's future development. As we transition from the era of exploration and trade to the period of formal colonization, it's important to recognize how these early economic activities shaped Canada's trajectory. The fur trade didn't just move animal pelts across the continent. It moved people, ideas, and cultures, creating complex networks of interaction that would define much of Canada's historical development. These foundations would prove crucial as Canada moved toward becoming a more formally organized colony under British rule. French colonization and the founding of New France. The story of French colonization in Canada begins with a mixture of ambition, hardship, and remarkable perseverance. Samuel de Champlain, often called the Father of New France, established Quebec City in 1608, not the first French settlement in North America, but certainly the most enduring. This small outpost on the cliffs overlooking the St. Lawrence River would become the foundation stone of French presence in Canada. Life in these early settlements was harsh beyond modern comprehension. The first winters claimed lives by the dozens as colonists struggled against extreme cold, scurvy, and inadequate supplies. Of the 28 colonists who spent the first winter at Quebec, only 8 survived to see spring. Yet despite these challenges, the colony persisted, driven by both economic opportunity and religious mission. Jesuit missionaries, arriving in the 1620s, sought to convert Indigenous peoples to Christianity, while traders pursued valuable furs that could make fortunes back in Europe. The French approach to colonization differed markedly from other European powers. Rather than establishing large agricultural settlements, New France focused on trade and strategic military posts along waterways. This created a unique pattern of settlement that stretched thousands of kilometers through the interior while remaining relatively sparse in population. By 1700, even after nearly 100 years of French presence, the entire population of New France remained below 15,000 settlers. The relationship between French settlers and Indigenous peoples proved both complex and crucial to the colony's survival. Through alliances like the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701, which united dozens of Indigenous nations with the French, the colony maintained a delicate balance of power in North America. These relationships weren't merely commercial. They involved deep cultural exchanges, intermarriage, and mutual dependence that created a distinct Canadian identity long before there was a Canada. The economy of New France revolved around three main pillars: the fur trade, fishing, and agriculture. While fur remained the most lucrative, the cod fisheries off Newfoundland became so important that they drew fishermen from across Europe. Basque, Breton, and Norman sailors established seasonal fishing stations along the Atlantic coast, creating some of the earliest sustained European presences in North America. Meanwhile, seigneurial estates along the St. Lawrence attempted to recreate French agricultural practices, though with mixed success due to the challenging climate and soil conditions. Social life in New France developed its own character. The legendary Filles du Roi, King's Daughters, arrived in the 1660s and 70s as part of an organized effort to balance the gender ratio in the colony. These women, often from urban poor backgrounds in France, found themselves transformed into pioneers who helped establish families that would form the backbone of French-Canadian society. Their legacy can still be seen in the genealogical records of many French Canadians today. Religious institutions played a dominant role in shaping colonial society. The Catholic Church wasn't just a spiritual authority. It became a central pillar of education, healthcare, and social welfare. Monasteries, convents, and parish churches dotted the landscape, serving both French settlers and converted Indigenous communities. This religious infrastructure would prove remarkably resilient, surviving even after British conquest and influencing Canadian culture for centuries to come. As the 18th century progressed, tensions between French and British interests in North America intensified. A series of conflicts, known collectively as the French and Indian Wars, saw control of territories shift repeatedly. Despite impressive French victories, like the successful defense of Quebec against British forces in 1711, the demographic and economic advantages of British colonies to the south put increasing pressure on New France. The 7 Years' War, which began in 1756, marked the beginning of the end for French rule in Canada. While French forces under commanders like Louis-Joseph de Montcalm achieved notable successes, including the taking of Fort William Henry in 1757, they couldn't match the resources and manpower of their British rivals. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would decide the fate of New France, culminating in the famous Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1759. When we look back at this period of French colonization, we see how profoundly it shaped Canadian development. The patterns of settlement, the relationships with Indigenous peoples, the economic focus on trade rather than agriculture. All these elements created a foundation that would influence Canada's path even after the British took control. The French colonial experience wasn't just a prelude to British rule. It established enduring characteristics that continue to define Canadian identity today. British conquest and the struggle for control. The transition from French to British control marked a pivotal moment in Canadian history, yet it wasn't the abrupt rupture many might imagine. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 officially transferred New France to British rule, but the reality on the ground proved far more complex. Thousands of French settlers remained, creating a unique cultural landscape that would define Canada's development. British authorities faced an immediate challenge: how to govern a predominantly French-speaking population while encouraging English settlement. Their solution came through the Quebec Act of 1774, a remarkably progressive piece of legislation for its time. This act preserved French civil law, protected Catholic religious practices, and maintained seigneurial land ownership while establishing British criminal law and governmental structures. The American Revolution dramatically altered this delicate balance. As 13 colonies declared independence, tens of thousands of Loyalists fled northward, seeking refuge in British territory. This massive influx of English-speaking settlers transformed Canada's demographic makeup. The division of Quebec into Upper and Lower Canada in 1791 reflected these changing circumstances, creating separate colonies for primarily English and French populations. The War of 1812 between Britain and the United States tested Canada's new political arrangements. What began as an international conflict became, for Canadians, a formative struggle for survival. The successful defense against American invasion attempts fostered a growing sense of distinct Canadian identity among both French and English inhabitants. Economic development during this period followed distinct regional patterns. The maritime colonies prospered through shipbuilding and fishing, while Lower Canada maintained its agricultural base. Upper Canada attracted American and British immigrants who developed farming communities along the Great Lakes. These economic differences mirrored growing political tensions between the colonies. By the 1830s, discontent simmered across Canada. In Upper Canada, the Family Compact held tight control over political power. In Lower Canada, the Château clique maintained similar authority. These small groups of elites governed with little accountability, sparking widespread resentment among ordinary citizens. The stage was set for dramatic change. The rebellions of 1837 and 1838 marked a turning point. Though militarily unsuccessful, these uprisings forced Britain to reconsider its colonial governance. Lord Durham's subsequent report recommended responsible government and the union of Upper and Lower Canada, suggestions that would fundamentally reshape Canada's political landscape. As Canada moved toward greater self-governance, it maintained its unique character, a country where French and English traditions existed in uneasy but productive partnership. This distinctive foundation would prove crucial as Canada approached Confederation and nationhood. Confederation and the birth of modern Canada. The journey toward Canadian Confederation began not with a grand vision of nationhood, but rather as a pragmatic solution to pressing political and economic challenges. By the 1860s, the British North American colonies faced mounting pressures that demanded new approaches to governance and cooperation. The province of Canada, divided between Canada West and Canada East, struggled with political deadlock, while maritime colonies grappled with economic uncertainty in the wake of changing trade patterns. The Charlottetown Conference of 1864, initially called to discuss a maritime union, became the unexpected starting point for a broader conversation about federal union. Delegates from the province of Canada seized the opportunity to present their case for a larger confederation. This led to the Quebec Conference later that year, where 72 resolutions formed the basis of what would become Canada's constitutional framework. These meetings weren't without tension. Debates over representation, regional interests, and cultural protections revealed deep divisions that required careful negotiation. The British North America Act, passed by the British Parliament in 1867, created the Dominion of Canada on July 1st, a date we now celebrate as Canada Day. This new federation initially united 3 colonies: Canada, which split into Ontario and Quebec, along with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Sir John A. Macdonald became the first Prime Minister, tasked with building the institutions of a new nation while navigating complex relationships between federal and provincial powers. Economic considerations played a crucial role in Confederation. The national policy, implemented in the 1870s, sought to strengthen Canadian manufacturing through protective tariffs while encouraging westward expansion. The promise of a transcontinental railway became both a symbol of national unity and a practical necessity for connecting distant regions. However, this economic vision came at a cost, particularly for Indigenous peoples whose lands were increasingly encroached upon by settlement and development. Confederation also marked a significant shift in Canada's relationship with Britain. While remaining part of the British Empire, Canada gained increased control over its internal affairs. This evolution of status found expression in areas like treaty-making powers and the establishment of Canadian diplomatic presence abroad. The creation of the Northwest Mounted Police in 1873 demonstrated Canada's growing capacity for independent action, particularly in asserting authority over newly acquired Western territories. As the 19th century progressed, Canada's identity continued to take shape through both achievement and controversy. The Manitoba school question in the 1890s highlighted ongoing tensions between English and French language rights, while the execution of Louis Riel in 1885 exposed deep divisions regarding Métis rights and Western development. These challenges tested the young nation's commitment to balancing diverse interests within a federal framework. Westward expansion and the Canadian Pacific Railway. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway stands as one of the most ambitious projects in Canadian history, symbolizing both the nation's potential and its complex relationship with development. Authorized in 1881 through a contract with a private syndicate, this monumental undertaking aimed to connect Canada's vast territory from coast to coast, transforming isolated regions into an integrated nation. Building the railway proved to be an engineering marvel and a human ordeal. Workers faced unimaginable challenges as they carved tracks through the rugged Canadian Shield, crossed endless prairies, and confronted the formidable Rocky Mountains. Chinese laborers, numbering in the thousands, played a crucial role in constructing the western sections, enduring harsh conditions while facing discrimination and receiving lower wages than their white counterparts. Their contributions came at great personal cost. Hundreds perished during construction due to accidents, disease, and exposure. The railway's completion in 1885 marked a turning point in Canadian development. The famous Last Spike was driven at Craigellachie, British Columbia, on November 7, 1885, creating the first transcontinental rail link. This achievement fulfilled a promise made to British Columbia when it joined Confederation in 1871, securing Canada's western boundary against American expansion. More than just steel rails, the CPR became a lifeline for settlement, trade, and national unity. Westward expansion brought profound changes to the prairies. The Dominion Lands Act of 1872 opened vast territories for settlement, offering 160-acre plots to homesteaders for a small fee. Immigrants from Europe, particularly Ukraine, Germany, and Scandinavia, transformed the landscape into productive farmland. Between 1896 and 1914 alone, more than 1 million settlers arrived, establishing communities that would become the agricultural heartland of Canada. However, this rapid development came at a significant cost to Indigenous peoples. The numbered treaties, negotiated between 1871 and 1877, transferred vast tracts of land to the government while promising reserves, annuities, and other rights. These agreements were often made under pressure and misunderstanding, leading to long-term consequences that continue to affect Indigenous communities today. The railway facilitated increased settlement and resource extraction, further disrupting traditional ways of life. Economic transformation followed the railway's path. Winnipeg emerged as the gateway to the West, growing from a small settlement to a major urban center within decades. New industries sprang up along the rail line, from grain elevators to manufacturing plants. The CPR itself evolved beyond transportation, developing hotels, steamships, and telegraph services that shaped Canada's economic landscape well into the 20th century. The impact of westward expansion extended beyond economics. It created new cultural landscapes where diverse immigrant groups mixed with established French and English populations. Ukrainian churches rose beside traditional Protestant denominations, while new agricultural practices transformed the prairie ecosystem. These changes laid the foundation for Canada's multicultural identity, while also highlighting tensions between different cultural groups and between settlers and Indigenous peoples. Canada in the World Wars, from colony to nation. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Canada found itself automatically at war alongside Britain. However, this conflict would transform Canada from a mere dominion of the British Empire into a nation with its own distinct international identity. The war effort began with enthusiastic recruitment drives that saw thousands of Canadians volunteer, believing they were embarking on a great adventure that would be over by Christmas. The reality proved far different. Canadian troops distinguished themselves early in the war during the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, where they faced the first use of chemical weapons on the Western Front. Despite suffering heavy casualties, their determined defense earned them respect among Allied forces. This pattern continued throughout the war, culminating in the famous victory at Vimy Ridge in April 1917, where all 4 Canadian divisions fought together for the first time, capturing a position that had previously resisted capture. The human cost was staggering. Over 60,000 Canadians lost their lives in the First World War, with many more wounded, a tremendous sacrifice for a country of just under 8 million people. These losses sparked growing sentiment for greater autonomy within the empire. Prime Minister Robert Borden insisted on separate representation for Canada at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, marking a significant step toward independent nationhood. The Second World War further accelerated this transformation. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, Canada waited 1 week before making its own declaration, a symbolic gesture of its increasing independence. Under Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, Canada carefully balanced its contributions between military engagement and homefront production, becoming one of the Allies' most important industrial suppliers. Canadian forces played crucial roles in major operations, including the Dieppe Raid in 1942, despite its tragic outcome, the invasion of Sicily in 1943, and the D-Day landings at Juno Beach in June 1944. By war's end, Canada had raised the 3rd largest navy in the world and maintained the 4th largest air force, while producing vast quantities of war materials that helped turn the tide against Axis powers. These conflicts brought significant social changes. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, particularly in war industries and agricultural work through organizations like the Farmerettes. Japanese Canadians faced internment and property confiscation following the attack on Pearl Harbor, leaving a dark stain on Canada's wartime record. Meanwhile, the Commonwealth Air Training Plan brought thousands of pilots from across the empire to train in Canada, strengthening international ties. The wars also transformed Canada's economy and global standing. Industrial capacity expanded dramatically, particularly in central Canada. The Bank of Canada gained increased control over monetary policy, and new social programs laid groundwork for post-war developments. Canada's participation in international organizations like the United Nations, established in 1945, reflected its emerging role as a middle power committed to multilateral solutions. As peace returned, Canada found itself changed forever. The sacrifices made during both world wars, combined with its growing international presence, cemented its status as an independent nation within the Commonwealth. These conflicts had not only tested Canada's military capabilities, but had fundamentally reshaped its society, economy, and place in the world. The Quiet Revolution and Quebec's independence movement. The Quiet Revolution, spanning from 1960 to 1966, marked a profound transformation in Quebec society that would reverberate throughout Canada. This period of rapid change began under the leadership of Jean Lesage, whose election as premier in 1960 ended decades of conservative rule by the Union Nationale. What made this revolution quiet was its peaceful nature, yet its impact proved anything but silent. The transformation touched every aspect of Quebec life. The government took control of major sectors, including healthcare, education, and social services through massive nationalization programs. Hydro-Quebec became a symbol of this new era when it absorbed private electricity companies in 1962, creating a powerful public utility that still defines Quebec's economy today. Education reform dismantled the traditional church-controlled system, establishing a modern secular network of schools and universities. Cultural awakening accompanied these structural changes. A new generation of Quebec intellectuals and artists emerged, challenging traditional values and advocating for greater autonomy. Figures like René Lévesque, who would later become a pivotal political leader, began questioning Quebec's place within Canada. The creation of the Ministry of Cultural Affairs in 1961 gave institutional support to this cultural renaissance, fostering Quebec's distinct identity through arts, media, and language promotion. Economic modernization became another crucial pillar of the revolution. The establishment of the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec in 1965 created a powerful investment vehicle to manage public sector pension funds, giving Quebec unprecedented economic leverage. Meanwhile, the government actively promoted French-Canadian businesses and sought to reduce traditional English, Canadian, and American economic dominance in the province. These changes naturally led to growing discussions about Quebec sovereignty. The Rassemblement pour l'Indépendance nationale formed in 1960, while more radical groups like the Front de Libération du Québec emerged soon after, arguing that only complete independence could secure Quebec's future. The October Crisis of 1970 underscored how far some were willing to go, culminating in kidnappings and a temporary imposition of the War Measures Act by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. The Parti Québécois, founded by René Lévesque in 1968, offered a democratic path toward sovereignty association. Their electoral victory in 1976 shocked many Canadians outside Quebec, bringing the independence question to the forefront of national politics. The first sovereignty referendum in 1980 produced a clear majority against separation. But the movement had already permanently altered Canada's political landscape. The constitutional debates that followed demonstrated how deeply Quebec's transformation had affected the entire country. The patriation of Canada's constitution in 1982, without Quebec's consent, created lasting tensions. These divisions would continue to shape Canadian politics through subsequent referendums and constitutional discussions, proving that Quebec's quiet revolution had sparked a national conversation about federalism, identity, and power sharing that continues to this day. Multiculturalism and modern Canadian identity. Canada's journey toward multiculturalism represents one of its most distinctive national characteristics, evolving from a policy of assimilation to an embrace of diversity that has become a model for nations worldwide. The official adoption of multiculturalism as government policy in 1971 marked a significant departure from previous approaches to immigration and cultural integration, acknowledging that Canada's strength lay in its diversity rather than despite it. This transformation didn't happen overnight. Waves of immigration throughout the 20th century brought diverse groups to Canada's shores. Ukrainians and Poles in the early decades, followed by Italians and Portuguese in the post-war period, and later immigrants from Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Each group faced challenges, but also contributed uniquely to Canadian society. The Chinese Head Tax and Exclusion Act, implemented in the late 1800s and early 1900s, stands as a stark reminder of earlier discriminatory policies, while the welcoming of Vietnamese refugees in the late 1970s demonstrated Canada's changing attitudes. The Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, established in the 1960s, initially focused on French-English relations, but expanded its scope to include other cultural communities. This broader perspective helped shape the Multiculturalism policy of 1971 and its subsequent enshrinement in the Canadian Constitution through the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982. These legal frameworks didn't just protect cultural differences, they celebrated them as fundamental to Canadian identity. Urban centers transformed into vibrant mosaics of cultures. Toronto became one of the world's most diverse cities, where over half the population was born outside Canada by the early 21st century. Vancouver developed its own distinct multicultural character, particularly evident in neighborhoods like Richmond, where Asian cultural influences shaped everything from cuisine to commerce. These cities demonstrated how multiculturalism could generate economic growth while enriching social life. However, multiculturalism hasn't been without its challenges. Debates about reasonable accommodation, particularly in Quebec, have tested the limits of cultural expression within a secular society. Issues surrounding Indigenous rights and reconciliation highlighted gaps between multicultural ideals and practical implementation. Anti-immigrant sentiment occasionally surfaced, challenging Canada's commitment to openness, especially during economic downturns or global crises. The success of multiculturalism is perhaps best measured in cultural achievements and social indicators. Canadian literature, music, and cinema increasingly reflect diverse voices and experiences. Figures like author Margaret Atwood, rapper Drake, and filmmaker Deepa Mehta represent different facets of Canadian creativity shaped by multicultural influences. Meanwhile, studies consistently show that immigrants to Canada achieve higher rates of economic success and social integration compared to many other countries. As Canada moves further into the 21st century, its approach to multiculturalism continues to evolve. New challenges emerge with increasing global migration and climate change displacement. However, the foundation laid through decades of policy development and social evolution positions Canada well to face these challenges while maintaining its commitment to diversity and inclusion, principles that have become fundamental to modern Canadian identity. Contemporary Canada. Challenges and achievements. As Canada entered the 21st century, it found itself at a crossroads of unprecedented opportunities and complex challenges. This period would test the nation's ability to balance its progressive ideals with practical governance, while maintaining its reputation as a global leader in social policy and international cooperation. The story of contemporary Canada is one of remarkable achievements, shadowed by persistent difficulties, where progress often came hand in hand with new complexities. environmental concerns emerged as one of the most pressing issues facing modern Canada. The Alberta oil sands, while contributing significantly to Canada's economy, became a lightning rod for debates about climate change and sustainable development. By 2010, Canada found itself at the center of global discussions about energy policy and environmental responsibility. Indigenous communities, particularly those affected by resource extraction projects, became powerful voices in shaping environmental policies and demanding greater consideration of traditional ecological knowledge. The tension between economic development and environmental protection played out dramatically in projects like the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, which faced legal challenges and protests while receiving federal approval. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, established in 2008, marked a significant step toward addressing historical wrongs against Indigenous peoples. Its final report in 2015 outlined 94 calls to action, challenging Canadian society to confront its colonial past while building more equitable relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. The discovery of unmarked graves at former residential school sites beginning in 2021 shocked the nation, renewing commitments to reconciliation and prompting difficult but necessary conversations about Canada's history. These revelations forced institutions across the country to re-examine their roles in perpetuating systemic discrimination while pushing forward initiatives aimed at cultural revitalization and economic empowerment for Indigenous communities. Technological advancement transformed Canadian society in profound ways. Cities like Toronto and Vancouver became hubs of technological innovation, attracting global talent and investment. The rise of artificial intelligence research, particularly in Montreal, positioned Canada as a leader in this emerging field. However, these developments also raised questions about privacy, data security, and the impact of automation on employment, challenges that Canadian policymakers struggled to address proactively. The gig economy expanded rapidly, creating new opportunities while testing Canada's social safety net. Traditional industries faced pressure to adapt to digital transformation, leading to both job displacement and new career possibilities in emerging sectors. Canada's approach to immigration continued to evolve, reflecting both humanitarian commitments and economic needs. The Syrian refugee crisis of 2015 saw Canadians welcoming over 30,000 refugees within months, demonstrating the country's capacity for compassion and integration. Meanwhile, the Express Entry system, implemented in 2015, streamlined economic immigration while attempting to address regional labor market needs across the country's diverse provinces and territories. Urban centers transformed into vibrant mosaics of cultures. Toronto became one of the world's most diverse cities, where over half the population was born outside Canada by the early 21st century. Vancouver developed its own distinct multicultural character, particularly evident in neighborhoods like Richmond, where Asian cultural influences shaped everything from cuisine to commerce. These cities demonstrated how multiculturalism could generate economic growth while enriching social life. However, multiculturalism hasn't been without its challenges. Debates about reasonable accommodation, particularly in Quebec, have tested the limits of cultural expression within a secular society. Issues surrounding Indigenous rights and reconciliation highlighted gaps between multicultural ideals and practical implementation. Anti-immigrant sentiment occasionally surfaced, challenging Canada's commitment to openness, especially during economic downturns or global crises. The emergence of populist movements and increased polarization in social media discourse presented new challenges to maintaining social cohesion while respecting diverse viewpoints. Economic inequality presented growing challenges despite overall prosperity. Housing affordability crises in major cities, particularly Vancouver and Toronto, highlighted widening gaps between rich and poor. The gig economy and changing nature of work created new precarities while testing Canada's social safety net. Governments responded with various policy experiments, including Ontario's Basic Income Pilot Project, though many initiatives faced political and practical hurdles. The COVID-19 pandemic, beginning in 2020, exposed and exacerbated existing inequalities while forcing rapid adaptation in healthcare, education, and workplace practices. Remote work became normalized, fundamentally altering urban dynamics and challenging traditional economic models. On the global stage, Canada maintained its reputation as a middle power committed to multilateralism. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's election in 2015 signaled a shift toward more active international engagement, particularly on issues like climate change and human rights. However, tensions with trading partners, especially during renegotiations of the North American Free Trade Agreement, demonstrated the complexities of maintaining economic relationships while pursuing independent policy goals. Canada's role in international organizations evolved, with increasing emphasis on gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, and climate action in foreign policy decisions. Social movements gained momentum throughout this period. The #MeToo movement sparked crucial conversations about sexual harassment and gender equality, leading to significant changes in workplace policies and cultural attitudes. Black Lives Matter protests following the murder of George Floyd in 2020 brought renewed attention to systemic racism in Canadian institutions. These movements weren't just about awareness. They led to concrete policy changes, organizational reforms, and shifts in public discourse that continue to shape Canadian society. Healthcare remained a defining characteristic of Canadian identity while facing significant challenges. The aging population placed increasing pressure on medical services, while mental health emerged as a critical focus area, requiring improved resources and reduced stigma. The legalization of recreational cannabis in 2018 marked a significant shift in drug policy, aiming to reduce organized crime while establishing a regulated market. Meanwhile, the opioid crisis demanded urgent responses from governments at all levels, highlighting the complex interplay between healthcare, law enforcement, and social services. Cultural achievements flourished alongside these challenges. Canadian literature, music, and cinema increasingly reflected diverse voices and experiences. Figures like author Margaret Atwood, rapper Drake, and filmmaker Deepa Mehta represent different facets of Canadian creativity shaped by multicultural influences. Meanwhile, studies consistently show that immigrants to Canada achieve higher rates of economic success and social integration compared to many other countries. The success of multiculturalism is perhaps best measured in cultural achievements and social indicators. Canadian literature, music, and cinema increasingly reflect diverse voices and experiences. Figures like author Margaret Atwood, rapper Drake, and filmmaker Deepa Mehta represent different facets of Canadian creativity shaped by multicultural influences. Meanwhile, studies consistently show that immigrants to Canada achieve higher rates of economic success and social integration compared to many other countries. Looking forward, Canada faces both opportunities and uncertainties. Climate change presents existential challenges that require immediate action, while offering possibilities for green innovation and sustainable development. Demographic shifts will continue to reshape the country's social fabric, while technological advances promise both disruption and transformation across all sectors. The relationship between federal and provincial powers remains a dynamic element of Canadian governance, particularly regarding issues like healthcare, education, and resource management. International relations grow increasingly complex in a multipolar world where traditional alliances face new pressures while emerging partnerships offer alternative opportunities. Perhaps most importantly, contemporary Canada continues to grapple with fundamental questions about its identity and purpose. What does it mean to be Canadian in an era of global interconnectedness? How can the country maintain its commitment to diversity and inclusion while addressing legitimate concerns about social cohesion? Where should the balance lie between individual rights and collective responsibilities? These questions don't have simple answers, but the very act of engaging with them reflects Canada's ongoing evolution as a nation. The dialogue between different perspectives, the willingness to challenge assumptions, and the commitment to finding common ground. These characteristics define contemporary Canada as much as any specific policy or achievement.